Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to tell you a story about Sharon. Sharon's story begins with a closed door. At 15 years of age, Sharon spent most of her time in her bedroom. She liked to read and write and paint. She had few close friends. Her family would describe her as a loner, somewhat of a troublemaker. You see, Sharon had a secret. She wanted to tell someone, but she was afraid. Then one day, she made the decision to tell her family. She mustered up all of the courage she had within her. And she walked through that door out to tell her family. I'm sure she suspected that things would not go very well. I can almost picture the scene. She walked down that hallway slowly and deliberately, looking for her family. She found them sitting at a table. The day that Sharon came out to her family, things didn't go very well. In fact, I'm not sure they could have gone much worse. They began to scream at her, called her vile names. And then someone began to hit her, first with their hands, and then with a belt. She pleaded with them to stop. She pleaded with them to listen. That only seemed to make them angrier. They threw her down on the ground, and they dragged her, kicking and screaming, back towards her room, where they threw her on the floor. And then somebody brought in a chair, and it was on that chair that they sat her. They took duct tape, and they taped her legs to the chair, then her arm to the chair, then her back and her chest to that chair. She cried, she screamed, stayed there for a couple of hours. Then they brought in a table. They set the table next to her. And on that table, they put a tape player. They began to play music and lectures they said would cure her, would get rid of those feelings, those emotions. She stayed in that chair for 3 days. She had no choice but to relieve herself in her clothes. She had very little to eat and drink, some bread and water. She felt she was going to go crazy if she didn't get out of that room. Late at night, in a fit of exasperation, she began to rock backwards and forward, more and more violently. Ultimately, she tipped the chair over backwards, and it broke. It took her more than an hour to get out of all that duct tape. When she did, she ran to the door. But her bedroom door was now locked from the outside. She turned back towards her room. Everything was gone, except for the broken chair. She took a piece. She went to the window, and she shattered it. Then she dropped to the ground below. At 15 years of age, Sharon was homeless and on the streets. Her parents never came looking for her, and she never contacted them again. While she didn't have to endure the disgust in her eyes anymore, she now faced the daily horrors of living on the streets as a teen. She had a lot of tough times there on the street, like other teens. In the United States, between 1.5 and 2.5 million youths are homeless. If a teenager identifies themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, then even the chance of becoming homeless is greatly increased. While LGBT youth make up about 5 to 10% of the population, They make up nearly 40% of the homeless population in many studies. It's tough for everybody out on the streets, but for LGBT youth, it's worse. For instance, 33% of homeless youth will report a sexual assault when they're on the streets. For LGBT youth, that number is near 60%. 27% of homeless teens will report alcohol abuse while on the streets. For LGBT youth, that number is 42%. 29% of homeless teens will attempt suicide when they're on the streets. For LGBT youth, the number is more than double at 62%. Sharon once asked me why anybody would think that a kid would want to be homeless. Sometimes, she said, there just wasn't another choice. These numbers were not just simple pie charts and graphs for Sharon. It was her real life. Her personal story included several brutal assaults, many thefts, countless sleepless nights. Sometimes she would sleep in a dumpster. Sometimes she would sleep in an alleyway. In those early months, something happened, and Sharon began to stand firm. It was in that time of her life that I first met Sharon. Sharon came through our door in a warm summer evening. She had dark hair, it was cut short. She was wearing a black concert t-shirt. She came to the Crews'n Healthmobile because she needed some help. She was having some allergies. She asked if we could help. I said yes. She was a charismatic kid. I liked her instantly. We chatted about concerts and music and life on the streets. And while I think we connected on that very first day, it would take her another 2 years before she would tell me her entire story. Over the next year, we saw Sharon. She seemed to transform, although I didn't recognize this at first. She began to develop an air of confidence about her. And other than that first time I met, every time after that, she had a job, sometimes 2 or 3. She needed our services less and less, but she came anyway. Even when she had a job that had insurance, she would still be a regular. Most of the time, it was because she would bring a friend or 2. She'd be out on the streets talking with somebody and find out they're homeless. So she'd give them a ride down to see the Crews'n Healthmobile. Sometimes she'd meet somebody simply had no other place to go. These kids, too, had dark stories. But with Sharon there, she would comfort them, assure them. They didn't trust us at first, but again, Sharon would say something like, everything's going to be okay. And you could see the calmness overtake. Likewise, those early years, the Crews'n Healthmobile began to grow, to expand. We provided more services, more appropriate services. We asked the right questions. We began to understand what was really important for these kids. A few years later, I had the opportunity to write a book called Ask Me Why I Hurt. And while doing some research, I got the chance to interview Sharon. We met at a restaurant. We talked for hours. We discussed things like pain, disappointment, hopes and dreams, responsibility and finding jobs. We laughed a bit and we cried a bit. At the end of the interview, I leaned forward and I asked her, "Why did you bring all those kids?" She replied simply, "They were kids worth saving." Today, I'm often asked what people can do to help these kids to continue the mission of the Crews'n Healthmobile and other organizations like it. How can we get these kids off the streets to protect them from those tragedies that I've talked about here today? I've answered that question a couple dozen times. I've come to realize that many people expect me to, they want me to say something like, well, if I had $5 million or a brand new mobile medical unit, or perhaps it's unlimited access to medications and supplies. I think people want an answer that is short and sweet and achievable. The answer is simple, just as Sharon put it. It's been difficult to achieve, but the truth is that until we all see these kids as worthwhile, until they themselves see that they are worthwhile, we cannot solve this problem. I don't have all the answers, but I suspect they begin with an open door.